But first we have to kind of lay out on the table what we're talking about with ADHD and SLI. And I've been playing around with different ways to set this up, but it helps to think about ADHD and SLI in the larger context. So one way of talking about this would be to point out something that's quite obvious, that everyone knows what ADHD is. Everyone has had their personal lives affected by someone with ADHD, much more so than the idea that that SLI is affecting multiple people. And so we can characterize ADHD as a very well-established clinical brand, whereas SLI is sort of marginalized in these discussions. I've offered sort of the standard definitions of both. In both of them, there's this notion that there's an unexpected difficulty relative to other areas. These are two conditions that seem to be comparably matched in terms of prevalence rates from epidemiological reports. In both areas, they represent the most common version or common type of the larger class of disorders that they belong to. So one thing that's very interesting about SLI relative to ADHD is that ADHD is a condition that is monitored by the Centers for Disease Control. We get information on disconnects between the prevalence rate based on epidemiological reports relative to how many kids are actually being diagnosed with ADHD. And there is a discrepancy, so much more kids are being diagnosed with ADHD than the epidemiological reports would suggest. But we are completely flying blind when it comes to SLI. It is not tracked by any entity, the Centers for Disease Control, the U.S. Department of Education, or ASHA. But based on epidemiological and longitudinal reports, it's pretty clear that that SLI is being wildly underdiagnosed. There is a male to female ratio well established in ADHD, slanted towards males, and in reports of SLI, we're finding out that things are much more balanced. Both conditions have a variety of different tools available to clinicians with standardized and non-standardized procedures. ADHD is recognized as a highly comorbid condition, co-occurring with just about everything else. And what we know about specific language impairment is that it does frequently co with reading disability, but there's some mixed signals about other areas that may or may not be compromised. In both areas, heterogeneity has encouraged different subtyping initiatives, and in both cases, the subtyping initiatives haven't shown developmental stability, but they seem to be clinically useful to think about ADHD without hyperactivity, ADHD without attention problems, and then the combined profile. And similarly in SLI, we talk about expressive and receptive deficits. In the ADHD world, it's interesting because there's a long-standing interest in establishing markers for differential diagnosis. And we'll take a look at some of the things that have been done there. In contrast, it seems like the SLI world is working in the different direction. So we start off with a constrained definition of who could fit the profile of SLI, and then we try to spread it out into areas outside of language. And then finally, it's clear that ADHD is a well-resourced disability with lots of financial and research dollars, a very large critical mass of investigators working on it, and the SLI world is wildly under-resourced relative to the prevalence rate of the condition. Okay, so if you were to try and synthesize what's available out there on ADHD and language impairments in terms of comorbidity, you can muster citations to support the claim that these things are frequently co-occurring. But you can also identify studies where there is much less of a prevalence rate of co-occurrence between the two conditions. And that in some studies, the co-occurrence rate gets very close to the population estimates. Okay, so I'm going to lay out a figure here in which we're going to take a look at prevalence rates and co-occurrence rates from 0% to 100%. And so to place things into reference, we'll start off with what's the official prevalence rate of ADHD based on the APA and meta-analyses of epidemiological reports. And then we'll contrast that with the diagnostic rate for both sexes that came out in 2013. And then we can disaggregate that value and identify that the Centers for Disease Control reports that 15% of males, school-age population, have been diagnosed with ADHD. And we also know, again, by virtue of the data collected by the Centers for Disease Control, that the diagnostic rate of ADHD actually varies quite considerably across different areas. So it's the western states, including Utah, have some of the lowest rates in the country, and the southern and eastern rates have much higher reported values. Okay, so then we bring in language impairment and or specific language impairment from the Ottawa and the Iowa epidemiological reports. And one thing that you can note right away is that there's a discrepancy in the recency of the information that's available to us in these two disorders. So we have a 15-year-old data that we're all using to provide support for how prevalent specific language impairment is. Okay, and as I mentioned before, nobody seems to be tracking this in any systematic way. And if you take a look at the caseloads or surveys that ASHA has collected over the years, ASHA has actually done a better job of tracking how many kids with ADHD are receiving services from speech-language pathologists. But we don't have any ability to identify kids who have primary language impairment or specific language impairment and how prevalent or how prominent they are in speech pathologist caseloads. Okay. And then what I've done here is I've tried to identify sort of the highest and the lowest values that are out there in terms of ADHD plus language impairment co-occurrence. Okay, so that almost covers the entire range with values around 3% to over 90%. Okay, and before I push the button and bring up the next slide, I want you to think about where might we see the distribution of other reports. Should it lean up more towards the high end or the low end? So that there should be some kind of pattern that comes out when we take a broader sample of reports. Okay, so what happens when you do that is you find a report that almost lands on every possible value that you could think of. So we've got reports that suggest these things are happening at more or less a 50% rate, and other reports that suggest that it's much lower than that, and other reports that suggest it's much higher than that. So basically this is a very generous body of research that can support any theory you want about